Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Don't Do Dumb webinar. I'm Jim Madel, financial advisor with Hendricks Wealth and Estate Management. I'm joined by Jim Hendricks, a certified financial planner and owner of our firm, and also by Sean Hendricks, financial planner and estate planning attorney. I see a lot of familiar people that have joined us tonight. We've been hosting these sessions both live near our office in West Dundee, Illinois, and via webinar as we're doing here this evening. We've covered a variety of financial topics that range anywhere from how to name beneficiaries on your accounts to be tax efficient, through how to have the right mix of aggressive versus conservative in your portfolio. Tonight, we're going to have Sean walk us through the world of trusts and their role in estate planning. So without further ado, here's Sean Hendricks.
All right, thank you very much, Jim. And so the name or the title of this presentation is In Trusts We Trust, Simplifying a Complex Process. In order to get started, to talk about trusts, first we have to talk about what is a trust. And the legal definition in Black's Law Dictionary says a trust is an equitable or beneficial right or title to land or other property held for the beneficiary by another person in whom resides the legal title or ownership recognized and enforced by the courts of chancery. It's definitions like this that why nobody likes lawyers. This definition doesn't really help us. So in trying to simplify what a trust is and really break it down, I like to talk about things in just plain English. So for me, the first step is to think about a trust as an agreement between the person who created the trust and the person who's going to take care of the property in the trust. We often call the person who created the trust the grantor or the settlor, and the person who takes care of the property in the trust the trustee. The agreement between the grantor and the trustee creates a legal entity, which we know is the trust, that is capable of holding property for the beneficiaries of the trust. So I like this definition better, but to even break it down a little further, I like to use analogies. So the analogy that really made sense to me when I was just a brand new lawyer, and the way that it was explained to me in my trusts class was to think about a trust like a boat. So if you imagine a trust as a big imaginary boat, you create the boat or you draft the trust to hold property for you, presumably to pass the property on to the next generation. Now, there are two types of trusts that we're going to discuss today, and I'm going to get into talking a little bit about both of them. In the first type of trust, a revocable trust, you name yourself as the initial captain of the ship, and you control the boat and everything on it during your lifetime. In the other type of trust, known as an irrevocable trust, you give someone else, or you give up ownership of the property of the boat, and you name someone else as the captain of the boat. And that person's job as the captain of the boat is to steer the boat according to the instructions in the trust. In this example of the irrevocable trust, you're not on board the boat. You kind of see the boat pull away from the pier. And we'll explain the significance of the two. But to give a little bit of a preview of the differences between revocable and irrevocable trusts, I'm going to start off talking about revocable trusts. Revocable trusts you'll often hear of as living trusts, like the so-and-so living trust. If you see that, it's more likely than not a revocable trust. In a revocable trust, the grantor and the trustee are usually the same person or people. You can have joint trusts. So you can have a trust with two grantors and two co-trustees, or you can have a trust with a single grantor and single trustees. The reason revocable trusts are called revocable trusts are because they can be changed or revoked during the grantor's lifetime. In the eyes of the law, the thing that makes revocable trusts unique is that because the property can be put into the trust and taken out of the trust by the grantor, in the eyes of the law, everything still belongs to the trust grantor. And more importantly, in the eyes of the IRS, everything in the trust still belongs to the trust grantor. One of the main reasons that we'll talk a little bit about that people like to use revocable trusts is because they avoid probate. And probate is a process by which the court oversees the distribution of assets. And probate itself is a process that if people can try to avoid it, a lot of times they want to, because the court process and probate can take a long time. It can take about a year and a half. And it can be pretty expensive. It can cost anywhere between 1% and 5% of the value of the estate. So if in order to avoid that court process and potentially avoid those costs, one of the main reasons people like to use revocable trusts is that the trust itself handles the property so that it doesn't have to go through the court system. So the majority of trusts are revocable trusts. So if you hear of trusts, or if you if you see that your neighbors might have a trust and their house is in that trust, it's pretty common to see revocable trusts. And if you hear people talking about them, a lot of times they're talking about revocable trusts. The other type of trust, and the less common type of trusts, are irrevocable trusts. Irrevocable trusts you might hear of, that there's a lot of acronyms, and I'll talk about these a little bit later when I'm talking more in depth about revocable trusts. But you might hear of ILITs or GRATs or IDGTs. These are all acronyms for certain types of irrevocable trusts. In an irrevocable trust, the grantor and the trustee are not the same person, okay? The grantor is literally putting someone else in charge of their property. An irrevocable trust can't be changed or revoked. The fact that it can't be changed or revoked is one of the main features that allows the property to be outside of the grantor's estate. So, and for that reason, in the eyes of the law, and more importantly, potentially in the eyes of the IRS, the grantor has given the property away. They no longer have control over that property. The irrevocable trusts, one of the main reasons people like them is because they also avoid probate. But with irrevocable trusts, we're really more concerned with trying to help with estate taxes. So these are very important kinds of trusts, but they are less common than revocable trusts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about revocable trusts first. And so a common question that I get is, okay, how do revocable trusts actually work? And the way that it starts is that the grantor or the grantors draft and create the trust during their lifetime. And if we remember our boat analogy, this is kind of like building the boat. Then once the boat is built, the grantor or the grantors name themselves as the initial trustee of the trust. And this is like they're making themselves the captain of the ship. During the grantor's lifetime, they control the trust, and they can add and remove property as they want to. And this is like the captain steering the ship. And the captain, along with the captain steering the ship, any property that's on the boat or in the trust goes right along with it. When the grantor passes away, or the second grantor, if it's a joint trust, that's when the next person in line, called the successor trustee, takes over. And the successor trustee, their job is to take control of the trust and to follow the instructions that are in the trust for distributing that property in the trust. So this would almost be like the first mate taking over as the captain of the ship. Once the property in the trust is distributed and the trust is empty, it ceases to exist. So I guess in our analogy, that's when the boat sinks. It goes away. So the positives to using a revocable trust, I mentioned this before, one of the most common reasons I see is because people use revocable trusts to avoid probate. So when most people are familiar with the concept of drafting a will as part of their estate plan. A will is a document that you draft while you're living that says, hey, here's what to do with my stuff after I pass away. But the problem with using a will is that the will itself doesn't really have any power until it's admitted to court. And the court process where a will is used to control what happens with the property, that's what's known as probate. The reasons that people don't like probate is, number one, it's a court proceeding. So any documents that are filed in the court are a matter of public record. So not everybody likes the idea of saying, hey, there might be an order that says, hey, my kids each got X amount of dollars. So revocable trusts are very private. There aren't records filed in probate because we don't have probate. And in a lot of states, nothing needs to be filed about the trust at all. The trust itself doesn't have to get filed. Some states do have these rules. So if you're outside of Illinois, it's good to know, and it's good to make sure that you're aware of this. But in most cases, the trust is still the more private way to go. The other reason that people like trusts, or the primary reason, is because they're more efficient, both in terms of cost and the administration. So going to probate typically costs between 1 and 5% of the value of an estate. So the estate doesn't have to be worth all that much before the cost of doing a trust is actually less than the cost of going to probate. So just from a pure dollars and cents standpoint, the avoiding probate can make a lot of sense. But the trusts are also potentially more efficient in the administration, because probate, because it goes through the court system, tends to take a while. It's not uncommon for probate to last a year and a half, or sometimes even longer if there are contested issues in the probate. And so a trust can sometimes do in a matter of months, and sometimes even a relatively low matter of months, what probate would otherwise take, potentially a year and a half to do. So that time savings and that efficiency in administration can really be a big benefit as well. And I've had clients who've done both roles. They've been an executor under a will in the probate process, and I've had clients who were trustees under a trust. And by and large, the ones who have filled both roles have said being a trustee was much, much easier. So that's one of the ways that it's potentially easier for the beneficiaries to be the beneficiaries under a trust than to inherit through a will. It's quicker, the oversight is less, there's less of a burden on the people who would receive assets through the estate. And finally, it's really, really easy to amend or change a trust. So typically, the trust will stay in the actual trust itself how to do this, but the vast majority of trusts just say, hey, if you want to make an amendment, it has to be in writing, it has to be signed by the people who created the trust or by the trustee, and it has to be delivered to the trust, which means it has to be put with the trust documents. So it's really, really easy to do. So those are some of the really good things and a lot of the reasons that I think trusts can be a great idea. But it's not all positives. There are some negatives to using revocable trusts as well. The tricky part about revocable trusts is that you really have to make sure that you keep your trust current. There are some administrative requirements. And the two biggies, this first one here that says home or vacation home, this is probably the biggest mistake that people make when they have a revocable trust, is they go through the process of getting their trust set up and they draft a deed that transfers their primary residence into their trust, and everything is set up right initially. But then they go and live another 20, 30, 40 years, and over that time they might buy a vacation home somewhere, or they move. And when they buy that vacation home or they move, they forget that they need to make sure that that other real estate is included in the trust. They forget to record a deed or take the necessary steps to make sure that that property is included in the trust. So the number one, the biggie, is stay on top of it. Make sure that everything that's supposed to be in the trust is in the trust. Or to use the boat analogy, make sure that everything that belongs on the boat is on the boat. Don't leave it on the shore. The second is, and this is true with wills as well, but you have to make sure that over time, if your wishes change, you have to make an amendment. If you change in your mind what you want to do, but you don't put it into your trust, that doesn't count. And there have been situations, and even in the past, where I've encountered trusts that were drafted that named people that my clients didn't even know anymore or didn't even associate with anymore. And so I'd ask them, who is this person? Who do you really want them in their trust? And they'll say, oh my goodness, I forgot that person was in there. And I say, okay, we are amending your trust right now. We are going to fix this. So you always have to make sure that your trust says what you want it to say. The other thing that, another negative of trusts is that because trusts don't go through the court system, they can't name legal guardians for minor children. Only a court can do that. So if you have children who are under the age of 18, the trust itself can't name guardians for them. There would be another document that works with your trust that could do that. We call that a pour-over will, but the trust itself can't establish guardianship. And finally, this is one of the biggest benefits of using a trust is that the courts aren't involved, but it's also one of the negatives potentially, because when a trustee is doing their job, they don't have a judge barking at them to make sure that they're getting things done. They have to take it upon themselves to do the things that need to be done. For example, when you have a trust, a trustee might have to sell a home. They might have to talk to an attorney. They might have to divide the assets of the trust. So it's going to be on that trustee to do those things. And so those are the main points about revocable trusts. I'm going to switch gears for a little bit, and I'm going to talk about irrevocable trusts. And so we learned that a revocable trust is called a revocable trust because it can be revoked or amended by the person who created it. An irrevocable trust is the opposite. It's called an irrevocable trust because it generally can't be revoked or amended by the person who created it. And so you may be thinking to yourself initially, all right, why would I want to do this? Okay. With an irrevocable trust, the person who created the trust is not the trustee, which means they give up control of the assets, and property that's given to the trust can't be taken back. So the creator of the trust is giving up ownership of the assets. Well, why would anybody want to do that? And the answer is generally the IRS. If by using an irrevocable trust, you can take your assets and you can get them outside of your taxable estate. And if those assets can grow outside of your taxable estate, you might be able to achieve some tax benefits from doing that for your estate. So if irrevocable trusts hold property outside of the estate and those assets do grow outside of the estate, you can avoid estate taxes that way, but there's something super, super important that you need to realize. You may be familiar with something called the lifetime gift tax exemption. It's historically, at least for the past few years, it's been a pretty high number at the federal level. In 2023, the gift tax exemption amount was $12.92 million. In 2024, it was $13.61 million, which means you wouldn't pay federal taxes as an individual if your estate was worth less than $13.61 million this year. Well, that might be, not everybody's in that category, but in 2025, there's a sunset provision in the law that created that made the tax exemption that high, and if it's not extended, if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is not extended, that exemption amount could drop to around $6 million. It's $5 million indexed for inflation. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to call it about $6 million. States can also have their own tax thresholds. For example, Illinois has a threshold of $4 million. But for the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to focus on the federal exemption amount for now. And one of the best ways I can illustrate this is through an example. And so we're going to talk about the example of Bob versus Steve. So these are for federal estate taxes, and by the way, this is very hypothetical. Okay, this assumes that the exemption amount is going to drop to $6 million. We don't know that. Hopefully it doesn't, but if it does, this example assumes that happened. So our first character, Bob, has $10 million. And sadly, Bob dies after the lifetime exemption threshold has dropped to $6 million. $6 million, that exemption amount of Bob's estate, is not subject to federal estate taxes. 10 minus 6 is 4, though, so that leaves $4 million that is subject to federal estate taxes. And at the current federal estate tax brackets, that would mean Bob's federal estate taxes would be $1.545 million roughly. So that's a lot of estate tax potentially to have to pay. And our other character, Steve, took a different approach. Steve has $5 million in his own that's in his estate, and he has an irrevocable trust with $5 million in it. So Steve, at some point in the past, took $1 million, and 21 years ago, he put $1 million into an irrevocable trust. And that irrevocable trust grew to $5 million over time. So Bob had $10 million. Steve had $5 million that was his, and $5 million in his irrevocable trust. Under this scenario, Steve won't owe federal estate taxes under the same assumption as we used with Bob. And this is because if the lifetime exemption amount is $6 million, Steve would have used up $1 million. So his exemption amount would have gone from $6 million to $5 million. Since Steve has $5 million, that amount would not be subject to tax. The $5 million that's in Steve's irrevocable trust is also not subject to federal estate taxes because it grew from $1 million to $5 million outside of his estate. Because remember, he gave that amount. That original $1 million was an amount that Steve gave to the trust. So in this hypothetical, Steve wins. I mean, sort of. He still died, but he wins the game of life. When I spoke before, I talked about different types of irrevocable trusts, and there are actually more than what are listed here. But if you are ever talking about these, or you're reading about them, or you want to do research about them, 3 pretty common types are: one is called an ILIT. It stands for Irrevocable Life Insurance Trust. And this is a type of trust it's an irrevocable trust that owns a life insurance policy on the life of the grantor. Upon the death of the grantor, the policy proceeds are paid out according to the terms of the trust. So it's called an irrevocable life insurance trust because the trust holds life insurance. A second type of trust that you might hear about is called a GRAT, or a Grantor Retained Annuity Trust. And the way that this trust works is the grantor puts assets into the trust and then receives annuitized payments from those trust assets. As long as those trust assets are growing faster than the annuity rate, the statutory annuity rate, there will be assets left over in the trust after the annuity period is expired, and those assets would be able to be passed tax-free onto the trust beneficiaries. A third type that you might hear about is called an intentionally defective grantor trust. And this would be similar to the type of trust potentially that Steve used, but in this type, the grantor makes a gift to the trust, and those trust assets are preferably invested or they grow over time. The trust income is taxable to the grantor. That's why we call it defective, because it's intentionally made so that it's taxable to the grantor during the grantor's lifetime. But then when the grantor dies, the assets in the trust pass outside of the grantor's estate. So all 3 of these strategies can apply in different ways for different people. And depending upon, a lot of different variables, they can be good options to consider. But those are some of the things that we can talk to you about and see if those would ever be a good fit for you. So the summary here is that the trusts generally come in 2 types. If you hear trust, for starters, if you hear trust, I want you to think of boat. You can think about whatever kind of boat is your favorite kind of boat, but think of a trust as a boat. And know that the 2 types of trusts are revocable trusts or irrevocable trusts. With revocable trusts being more common, and the main reasons that people like to use them is because they avoid probate, they're private, and they are usually more efficient. Even though irrevocable trusts are less common, they also avoid probate, but our irrevocable trust is really trying to pass assets outside of the grantor's taxable estate. Now, in addition to some of the things that I've said, I did want to I wanted to turn the mic over to Jim for a minute because we've been doing some things in our practice using trusts that we feel is fairly unique to us. And I wanted to give Jim or a minute or two to talk about that. Jim, are you
Yep.
ready?
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, very good. So a few things that I wanted to do. First of all, I did create a poll. You haven't been using these polls very often during these presentations, but I did create a poll. I'm going to start it right now. So I just started it. And if you go to the polls section down on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a question. We just want to kind of get a readout on how knowledgeable you felt about trusts before attending this presentation. And hopefully by the time you leave today, you'll feel like you've gained some knowledge about trusts. It's a very important part of estate planning and potentially of investment management. And it's highly underutilized. We see a lot of people who really don't have a trust when they first come to us that really, really should. So we advise people quite often to get trusts set up. I'm seeing some answers pour in now about people's knowledge. Looks like we're ranging from 3 to 8 so far on the replies. There's somebody that was a 9. So we've got some people with some good base knowledge about trust. So this presentation might have been somewhat redundant for you. But you see a lot of people, even celebrities, that pass away without doing proper estate planning. And so trusts are very, very much underutilized. And we try to encourage people that we work with to do the proper things to make sure they're doing the best things for their estate, which in many cases does involve getting at least an irrevocable trust created. One other thing I'll mention before I get into the specifics of what we do in our practice. You saw that Sean had mentioned that Illinois has a $4 million estate tax exemption, which is actually lower than the federal exemption amount. So there can be cases when your estate is below the federal estate tax level where it could very much make sense for you to create an irrevocable trust during your lifetime so that you can get assets to grow outside of your estate. I've noticed we have some people from Hawaii that are in this meeting here, and the estate tax exemption in Hawaii is $5.49 million, and the estate tax rate in Hawaii varies from 10 to 20%, depending on how large your estate is. So a lot of times you'll even see people move from state to state to try to avoid probate. There are certain states that don't have an estate tax, Florida being probably the most headline grabbing one, Florida and Texas. Neither of those states have estate taxes. So if you pass away as a Hawaii resident versus a Florida resident and you're wealthy, you could end up paying much, much more in taxes from your estate if you're living in a state that does have an estate tax like Hawaii, California, Illinois, and so on. Getting on to what we do in our practice, and this is becoming a much, much more important area of estate planning, and in my opinion, a really good reason to use a financial advisor, is with the change in tax law through the Secure Act in 2019, people who inherit IRAs, which, by the way, in our opinion, should not be mixed with a trust. When you inherit an IRA, you have 10 years to liquidate that IRA. And let's say your children are going to be your beneficiaries of your IRA. If your children are of working age and they've got to liquidate that IRA within 10 years, that's going to be during likely their earning years, during their working years. And if you have more than one child, those children might have different careers that have them in different tax brackets. So let's say you have an IRA and a house and an investment account, right? Well, what you can do with a trust is we can use if we title your house and your investment account into a trust, and then you separately have your IRAs, we as your financial planners can work with your IRA, name your beneficiary percentages so that your higher earning child, let's say you've got one child that's a rocket scientist and another one that's a dog walker, both very noble professions, but one tends to earn a little bit more than the other. Your rocket science child could receive more of your trust assets, and we could make those changes right within the trust document if it's drafted properly in a very, very simple fashion. And then we could leave more of your taxable accounts, your IRAs, to the lower earning child. And what this does is it makes both of your children, in this case, inherit more money net of taxes and leaves less to the IRS through the estate planning process. And again, we feel like we're kind of on the cutting edge of this here in our practice, and we do help our clients get this system up and running, and trust assets make it much, much, much easier to do this. If you own your home in trust, it's a lot easier to do this than it would be if your home were to be not owned in trust and would be just passing through the probate of your estate. So again, we're working with people to kind of incorporate this trust management into our practice on a pretty big level. And again, we feel like we're on the cutting edge of this since the passage of the Secure Act in 2019.
Absolutely. Excellent. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Sean. I do see some questions have come in during the presentation. If you have any questions now, please use the Q&A section down below, and we'll start answering questions. So, Sean, if you're ready to put on your estate planner hat.
Yeah, I can take a swing at least most of
Yeah.
them.
So we have one here. Do amendments need to be notarized?
So the trust itself governs what is required when to amend it, but the vast majority of trusts, all it needs to be is in writing. It needs to be signed by the grantor and then delivered to the trustee. And if you accomplish those three things, the amendment is valid. Now, as a matter of practice, I will typically observe the same formalities as the original trust with an amendment, which means even if the trust doesn't require it, I will still usually, if the original trust was notarized and witnessed, a lot of times I will notarize and witness, because why not clear the bar by even more? But more importantly, it reduces the likelihood of any challenge being successful. So if the amendment is challenged for any reason, the witnesses and the notary strengthen the position. So in my opinion, it's why not? Why not do that?
Perfect. Perfect. Another one here. Do you recommend both a will and a trust? Does that solidify any questions?
So another excellent question. And whenever I draft a trust for anyone, my default position is that they're also going to get a will. Now, hopefully, if the trust does what it's supposed to do, that will never see the light of day. It will live in a binder, and that it will never be taken out because there will be nothing to probate. But for every trust that I draft, I will also recommend or include a document called a pour-over will. And that pour-over will, its entire job is to say, hey, I have a trust. And so for whatever piece of property didn't make it into my trust, if there's some piece of property that just wasn't recorded correctly in the trust, I want it to be treated as though it were put through the trust. And in that scenario, it might mean that there's some piece of property that has to go through a separate probate proceeding. They sometimes will call that an ancillary probate proceeding. But the job of that separate will is to act like a big safety net for the trust. And so the answer to the question is yes, it is a good idea to have both. I strongly recommend having both.
Perfect. All right, we have one here. Will a recording of tonight's webinar be provided to the attendees? I've been listening but driving, but unable to focus on the slides. Yes, we can send out a recording of tonight's webinar to anyone that is interested. I'll actually send it out to the entire list. Takes a while for the recording to actually process, so I'll send it out at some point tomorrow morning. I can also include a copy of the slide deck for anyone as well. So very good question there. We have one. Do revocable trusts become irrevocable when the grantors die?
The short answer to that question is yes. A revocable trust is only revocable by the grantors. So when the grantors pass away, there's nobody left with the authority to revoke it. So revocable trusts do become irrevocable when the grantors die. The logic being that the grantors wrote the trust for a reason, and they wanted those instructions in the trust to be carried out. So the trust itself and the instructions in the trust become locked in after they pass away. The the revocable trust actually becomes its own separate legal entity requiring its own tax identification number after the death of the grantors. So yes, revocable trusts do become irrevocable after the grantors die.
Excellent. We have one here. You have 10 years to liquidate the inherited IRA based on what date? Your age of retirement or the date of the death of the individual from whom you inherited the IRA? The answer to that is, oh, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I was going to say I can take that one.
Yep.
So it's 10 years from the death of the decedent. You have 10 full calendar years to liquidate the IRA. So let's say somebody were to pass away today, then that IRA must be liquidated by the end of 2034, by December 31st, 2034. So it's not based on your own retirement date at all. It's based on the date of death of the decedent who originally owned the account.
Perfect. Do you support digital trusts?
So these are something that we might see more in the future. In my practice, I don't use digital trusts. And there's two contexts in which digital trust means potentially two things to me. It might refer to digital assets, in which case I do put clauses in my trust that give the trustee power over digital assets. But it's also trusts that only exist electronically. And in that sense, until things are a little more clear, I still draft everything on paper and print it out on paper, and we sign and execute things the old-fashioned way, just because the law is pretty clear and well settled about how those work. But I could see digital trusts and trusts that exist only in electronic format becoming more popular in the future.
Excellent. We have another one here. How do you put your house into the trust?
Okay. So I'm a licensed attorney in Illinois, so I can answer this question for the state of Illinois. Outside of Illinois, I can tell you generally what I think the rule is, but if you are outside of Illinois and you have to actually put your house in a trust, I would encourage you to work with a qualified real estate attorney to make sure that's done correctly. But in Illinois, the way that you put your house into a trust is we draft a deed. So when you own your house, when you own your house outright, your deed for your home will list you, or if you're a married couple, it will list you as a married couple, as the owners of the home. After the trust is drafted, we will draft a deed that transfers the property, and this might sound silly, it transfers it from yourself as an individual to yourself as the trustee of the trust. And so we draft that deed transferring the property from the individual to the trustee as the trustee of the trust, and that's how we put the house in the trust. That's not the last step, though. That deed has to be recorded with the county recorder in the county where the property resides. So for the vast majority of trusts that I draft, that also includes drafting a deed for at least the primary residence, so that we make sure that we get that property in the trust or on the boat, as I like to say. We want to make sure that the primary residence and any other real estate gets into the trust the way that it's supposed to. For folks that live in other states, it is, I want to be careful because I believe the majority of states have something similar to Illinois, where you have to draft and record a deed. But the requirements from state to state can vary a little bit. So I don't want to give a blanket answer for other states and then have someone do things wrong. So if you're outside of Illinois and you have a trust and you have a piece of property that you need to get into that trust, I would strongly recommend talking to a real estate attorney who works in the county where that property is located, because they would be the person most knowledgeable to make sure that properly gets into the trust.
All right, excellent. We have a question here. The parents are still living and exist in one state, and the siblings exist in other states. Can they be trustees?
Absolutely. Uh, so a trust drafted in any given state is still valid in every other state as long as it was valid in the state where it was originally made. So there's nothing about a trust that restricts the beneficiaries or the trustees from going out and living their lives. uh, the Something that might be a factor in choosing a trustee is geography, meaning if you have three kids and one of them is your next door neighbor and the other one lives 1,000 miles away, you might want to consider the kid that lives real close as as the first in line successor trustee. But there's nothing that prohibits it. The the ability of the trustee is the primary consideration, but if everybody's roughly equal, a lot of times I'll say, hey, who lives closest? And sometimes the person who lives closest is a great option, but there's nothing that prevents them from being able to live in other states.
Excellent. Okay, we have two questions that are very similar here. So, Jim, this one will be for you. If I die before the 10 years expire for my inherited IRA withdrawal, how does this affect my beneficiaries?
Can you say that one more time?
So if someone inherits an IRA and they
Uh-huh.
pass away before the 10 years have expired, how does
Mhm.
that affect their beneficiaries, the next in
Gotcha.
line?
The IRA must be liquidated within 10 years of the date of the original owner of the account. So, in the eyes of the IRS, it doesn't give you a benefit if your beneficiary dies. It doesn't start that 10-year clock over again.
All right. Excellent. All right. When you sell your house, do you have to take it out of the trust?
So this is a good question. The answer is no. But when you sell that house, and if it's still in the trust, then the check is going to be made payable to the trust. And so you then have to open up a trust account in the name of the trust to deposit that check. So you don't have to take it out. It could stay in the trust, but for practical considerations, it can make closing on a house tricky. So especially if you're trying to sell a house that's in a trust and then buy another house and transfer that house directly into your trust, that can get tricky. And so you're taking a real estate closing, which can already be a dicey process, and you're throwing in a couple variables that might make it difficult. So I don't tell people they have to take it out of the trust to sell it, but I tell them it might be a good idea to take it out of the trust, take the house out of the trust, sell it, buy the new house that you're going to buy, and then after the closing and after the dust settles on that closing, then we draft another deed to transfer it into the trust. It takes some discipline to do that. It means we have to make sure that we follow all the steps that we need to follow. But if you sell your house, you don't have to take it out of the trust, but it might be a good idea to do so.
Excellent. And the final question we have here is what is the proper process for adding a home into a trust to utilize step-up basis regarding home purchase prices from decades ago versus fair market price of current day?
So we already talked about this a little bit for the process for adding the home into the trust. In Illinois, at least, we add the home into the trust by recording a deed that transfers the property from the individual to the trustee of the trust. When we're talking about an irrevocable trust, that house is still yours in the eyes of the law. So from the time that you transfer that property into the trust, the step up in basis doesn't have anything to do with the date that was transferred into the trust. Um, but if I'm going to try to read between the lines with this question a little bit, um, the when you buy a home and you buy that at the original basis, whatever the home is purchased for, and the home is passed to the next generation through a trust, The step up in basis that you get is still based on the date that the individual passed away. So if the house continues to be held in trust after the date that the individual passed away, the new basis becomes the date of death of the decedent. And so there is the potential for a capital gain to apply from the date of the death of the decedent until the date that the property is actually sold. So it's a little hard for me to talk about the value of a purchase price from decades ago versus fair market value current day. There's a little bit of a tax implication there, and Jim, I don't know if you're able to see that question, or if that means a little more to you than to what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I believe he answered it the right way. It's the step up in basis is just on what the cost was when you originally purchased it. It doesn't really have anything to do with the date it was put into the trust. So, yeah. All right.
Really, really good questions this time
Yeah,
around.
some excellent questions this time around. So that's it for the questions. So Jim, Sean, you guys have anything else you want to add?
No, if you're like me and you think of questions after this, you can always call us or email us too.
Absolutely, absolutely. For those of you that are still with us here, our next Don't Do Dumb webinar will be on September 4th, and that will be how much risk should you take in retirement? So thank you guys all for attending. You'll see an email coming out about that in the next few weeks here, and we hope to see you then. Again, any questions that come in, feel free to shoot them to our emails. All right. I appreciate it.